There are towns in Montana that feel like they exist slightly outside of time. Towns where the mountains are so close that they seem to lean in, where the winters arrive without warning and the summers burn bright and brief, and where everyone knows the name of everyone else's dog. Trego is one of those towns. Tucked into Lincoln County in the far northwestern corner of the state, pressed up against the Kootenai National Forest, it is the kind of place where strangers are noticed and neighbors are trusted, sometimes too deeply, sometimes past all reason. In the autumn of 1999, Trego had fewer than 400 residents. It had no traffic lights. It had a post office, a school, a scattering of homes along roads that turned to mud in the spring thaw, and it had the kind of quiet that city people spend their whole lives searching for. Children played outside until dark. Front doors were left unlocked. People waved from their trucks and meant it. On the morning of October 7, 1999, a 31-year-old woman named Christy Schellberg walked out of her home and did not come back. She left behind a young daughter, a husband, a half-finished cup of coffee on the kitchen counter, and a silence that would press down on her community for the next 23 years. What happened to Christy Schellberg? And more haunting still, how could someone vanish so completely from a place where no one was supposed to be a stranger? To understand what happened in Trego in 1999, you first have to understand what Trego was. Not in any romantic sense, but in the honest, unvarnished truth of a small rural community living at the margins of an American economy that had, by the late 90s, largely moved on from the timber industry that had built places like this one. Lincoln County stretches across the northwestern edge of Montana like a long, narrow corridor, bordered by Idaho to the west and Canada to the north. The Cabinet Mountains rise in the south. The Whitefish Range dominates the east. Between them, along the Kootenai River Valley, small communities clung to existence, Eureka, 14, Ricks Ford, and Trego among them. The landscape is extraordinary. The economics are not. By 1999, mill closures had gutted the region's employment base. Families who had worked the same timber operations for 3 generations found themselves piecing together seasonal work, hunting and fishing to supplement pantries, driving long distances for jobs that paid modestly and demanded everything. The Schellberg family lived in a small house on a property outside of Trego proper, down a gravel road that wound through second-growth forest. The house itself was modest, 2 bedrooms, a wood stove, a porch that faced toward the trees. Christy Schellberg had grown up in the region. She had wide eyes and dark hair and a laugh that neighbors described, years later, as the kind of laugh that made a room feel warmer without the speaker trying to do anything at all. She worked part-time at a local establishment and cared primarily for her daughter, who was 4 years old in the fall of 1999. Her husband, Robert Schellberg, was 34. He worked intermittently in logging-adjacent labor equipment maintenance, hauling, and was known in the community as a quiet man, reserved, not unfriendly but not the sort to linger at the hardware store and trade stories. People knew him the way you know the weather. You watched it, you noted it, you mostly stayed out of its way. October 7, 1999 was a Thursday. The temperature that morning sat just above freezing. A low ceiling of cloud had moved in overnight, giving the sky the flat gray quality that arrives in northwestern Montana well before winter announces itself formally. The aspens along the road had turned. Their leaves lay in damp clusters on the gravel. The light, what there was of it, arrived late and reluctant. Christy Schellberg had by all accounts a routine. She rose early. She made coffee. She got her daughter settled with breakfast before beginning whatever the day required, errands, cleaning, the particular orchestration of domestic life in a place where the nearest large grocery store was a significant drive away. Neighbors who spoke to investigators later remembered seeing her vehicle parked at the house the previous evening. Nothing appeared wrong. Nothing appeared out of place. At some point during the mid-morning hours of October 7th, Christy left the house. She did not take her daughter. She did not leave a note. She did not tell anyone where she was going. This was, by every account gathered in the days that followed, unusual. Christy was attentive to her daughter to a degree that those who knew her described as fierce. She did not leave the child unattended. She did not take off without word. Robert Schellberg later told investigators that he had been away from the home that morning working. He said he returned in the early afternoon and found the house empty. His daughter was there alone, which was noted quietly by the deputies who eventually came, but Christy was not. He said he waited. He said he assumed she had stepped out and would be back. He said he made dinner for the child. He did not call to report his wife missing until the following morning, October 8, 1999, at approximately 9:40 in the morning, more than 24 hours after he claimed to have first noticed her absence. The Lincoln County Sheriff's Office received the call. Deputies were dispatched. They arrived at the Schellberg property and found Robert calm, composed in the way that might in one context be read as stoic and in another context be read as something else entirely. His daughter sat quietly in the living room. A toy truck lay on its side near the doorway. A child's drawing was pinned crookedly to the wall. The swing on the porch hung still. Pause. Clears throat. The coffee cup was still on the counter. The half-finished cup that had been sitting there since the morning before, and possibly longer. The search for Christy Schellberg began formally on October 8, 1999, and expanded rapidly over the following 3 days as the Lincoln County Sheriff's Office organized coordinated efforts across the surrounding terrain. Search and rescue teams were deployed into the National Forest east and south of the property. Volunteers arrived, and in a community the size of Trego, the arrival of volunteers means nearly everyone capable of walking and carrying a radio showed up. They walked grid lines through dense timber, called her name into draws and ravines, checked along the creek beds that ran through the lower elevations. Aircraft from the county's search and rescue coordination flew grid patterns above the forest. Dogs were brought in. Train trackers attempted to establish a direction of travel from the property, but found the conditions difficult. Rain had moved through the area the night of October 7th, not heavy, but persistent, the kind of soft, relentless moisture that erases the faint and keeps only the obvious. There was little that was obvious. The community response was immediate and genuine. People who had known Christy since childhood drove up from Eureka and 14. Women from the school organized food for the search teams. Men who had logging shifts canceled them. In those first days, the effort was enormous, and the anxiety was real because everyone who searched had a version of the same thought. This is a small place, and we know it, and she should be findable. She was not found. Clears throat. Within the first week, investigators from the Lincoln County Sheriff's Office had begun building a working timeline, and the timeline presented problems. Robert Schellberg said he had left for work early in the morning on October 7th and returned in the early afternoon. He gave investigators a general account of where he had been and what he had done. When deputies attempted to verify those movements, speaking to individuals at the locations he mentioned, checking what records were available, the account held in places and softened in others. There were stretches of time that morning that could not be fully accounted for by independent witnesses. There were miles driven that, when measured against the stated itinerary, did not quite resolve. A neighbor, whose property bordered the Schellberg land on the western side, and who had asked not to be named in contemporaneous press coverage, told investigators that she had heard a vehicle on the gravel road early that morning, before the time Robert said he had left. She could not say with certainty whether it was Robert's truck. She could not say with certainty whether it was headed toward the main road or away from it. But she heard it. She noted it because the sound woke her, and she noted what time it was because she looked at the clock, and the clock read 5:47 in the morning. Robert had told investigators he left the property around 7. Deputies noted this discrepancy. They noted it carefully and said nothing about it publicly. The physical evidence gathered from the property and surrounding area was limited in scope and inconclusive in nature. Investigators processed the house. They collected items for analysis. No forensic findings from this initial phase were ever released publicly that pointed unambiguously toward what had happened. Christy's vehicle was at the property. Her wallet was located inside the home. Her winter coat and October nights in Lincoln County are cold, reliably, pressing toward the 20s by midnight. Her winter coat was on a hook by the door. Those who knew her said she would not have walked into those woods without her coat, not voluntarily, not in October. Deputies whispered quietly in those early days about the absence of a coat, the absence of a purse, the absence of any indication that Christy had prepared to go anywhere at all. You do not step out of your house without a coat in the Montana mountains in October and simply vanish into the landscape. You do not leave your 4-year-old daughter alone and wander into the forest. Robert Schellberg, through those early days of searching and questioning, maintained a composure that those who encountered him remembered. He answered questions. He cooperated. He thanked people for searching. A woman who volunteered in the search efforts in the first week later described sitting across from him at a community gathering held to organize the effort. He was very still, she said. People were crying. People were holding each other. He was very still. He kept his hands folded on the table. He watched the room. She said she thought about those hands for a long time afterward. The investigation continued through October and into November. As the snow began to close down the higher terrain, the search shifted from active physical efforts to interviews, records, and the slow, methodical work of building a picture from fragments. Investigators spoke to family members, to Christy's friends, to acquaintances, to anyone who had any point of contact with either Christy or Robert in the weeks and months leading up to October 7th. What emerged, gradually and without any single dramatic revelation, was a picture of a marriage under significant strain. Multiple individuals close to Christy said that she had been unhappy, that she had spoken, in the months before her disappearance, about leaving, that the situation at home was not good, though she had not been specific about the nature of what was not good. One close friend told investigators that Christy had called her in August of 1999, about 6 weeks before she vanished, and said something that the friend carried with her for years. She said Christy had told her, "I'm trying to figure out how to do this. I'm trying to figure out how to get out." The friend asked what she meant. Christy said she couldn't talk about it right then. She did not call back. The case slowed. The physical searches wound down. By the spring of 2000, with Christy Schellberg still missing and no body recovered, the active investigation had contracted. The Lincoln County Sheriff's Office maintained the file. Periodically, deputies reviewed it, but without new evidence, without a body, without a witness willing to testify to something concrete, the case entered that particular limbo that law enforcement professionals know and hate, the cold file, open in name, still, in practice. Months became a year became 2. The name Christy Schellberg faded from the regional headlines. The search posters yellowed and came down from the windows of Trego's small businesses. The toy truck stayed on its side, in the memory of everyone who had been inside that house. Robert Schellberg did not stay in Trego. In the spring of 2001, approximately 18 months after Christy's disappearance, he relocated. He moved with his daughter, who was by then 5, and who had not stopped being the child who sat quietly in that living room on October 8, 1999, while deputies moved through the house and asked her father careful questions. They moved to a neighboring state. He found work. He built, in the way that some people are able to build, a new life in a new place, layered over the old one. People in Lincoln County noticed his departure. Some said nothing. Some said what they thought quietly to each other, in the way that small communities process the things they cannot resolve officially. There were those who believed he had done something to Christy. There were those who believed just as firmly that a man driven out by gossip and suspicion had every right to take his child somewhere he could breathe. For those who have ever doubted someone you love, or someone you thought you knew, you understand what that position requires of you. You understand the cognitive labor of holding two possibilities simultaneously, that the person is what they appear to be, or that they are not. That the ordinary surface of a life conceals something extraordinary in its darkness. People in Trego held both possibilities for years, and the holding wore on them. Christy's family, her mother, her siblings, several cousins who had grown up alongside her in Lincoln County, did not move on. They could not move on, in part because moving on requires a fixed point from which to depart, and they had no fixed point. They had no grave. They had no explanation. They had a woman-sized absence in the shape of someone they had known and loved, and the absence did not diminish with time. It accumulated. Her mother, in the years following Christy's disappearance, was known to keep a photograph on her kitchen table, not framed, just placed there. Christy, at around 25, smiling at something outside the frame of the picture, caught in a moment of genuine happiness that had no awareness of what was coming. People who visited the house said the photograph was always there, said her mother would sometimes look at it in the middle of a conversation briefly and then look back. The daughter, Christy's daughter, who was 4 years old on October 7, 1999, grew up with what children grow up with when the foundational facts of their lives are catastrophic and unexplained. She grew up in the household of a father who had been suspected and never charged. She grew up without her mother and without an explanation for the absence. She grew up in a state that was not Montana, in a community that did not know her history, attending schools where no one knew what she carried. Former neighbors who had known the family reported small fragments over the years, things heard secondhand, things pieced together from the particular telegraph system of a community that has not forgotten a woman even if it cannot name what happened to her. There were accounts, eventually, of the daughter drawing pictures as a young child that her father found troubling. Pictures of her mother, pictures of the house in Trego. Accounts of nightmares that the child had with enough regularity that a school counselor, years after the move, reached out to the father about them. What was said in those conversations between the father and the counselor is not known. What is known is that the nightmares continued. Robert Schellberg, in the years following his relocation, had relationships. He was seen with women in his new community. He presented, to those who met him without the context of what had happened in Trego, as quiet but functional. Not warm particularly, but not strange. He did not discuss Christy. He told people when her absence came up that she had left, that she had walked away from the family. This was not a legally established fact. It was a narrative he offered, and some people accepted it, because people generally accept the narratives offered to them by people they have no reason to doubt. Those in Lincoln County who had known Christy found this narrative, when they heard about it through various channels over the years, enraging. Not because they could prove it was false, because they knew Christy. Because the woman in that photograph on her mother's kitchen table was not a woman who walked away from her 4-year-old daughter. because the coat was still on the hook. Clears throat. For those who have ever loved someone who simply stopped being present, whether by loss or by choice or by something in between, you understand the way uncertainty corrodes. It is not a dramatic thing. It does not arrive in an episode and depart. It settles slowly into the daily fabric of everything. It is in the way you answer when someone asks about her. It is in the way you pause before you say something. It is in the particular silence that falls over a table when someone mentions a name. By 2015, 16 years had passed. Christy Schellberg's case remained in the open files of the Lincoln County Sheriff's Office, reviewed periodically but inactive for lack of new evidence. Technology had advanced significantly. Forensic science had changed. DNA processing that had not been available in 1999 was routine in 2015. Digital records that had not existed in 1999, cell phone location data, electronic financial transactions, the accumulated digital record of a modern life, were now retrievable in ways that investigators in 1999 could not have anticipated. The Lincoln County Sheriff's Office, in the middle years of the 2010s, undertook a systematic review of cold case files. This was not unusual. Departments across the country had begun dedicating resources to unsolved cases that new forensic tools might crack open. The Christy Schellberg file came up in that review. Investigators who had not been involved in the original 1999 case pulled the materials and read them with fresh eyes. They looked at what had been collected. They looked at what had not been collected, or what had been collected and not fully processed with the tools then available. They looked at the timeline. They looked at the neighbor's statement about the truck at 5:47 in the morning. They looked at Robert Schellberg's account of that morning and the miles that did not quite resolve. And then something shifted. The breaking point came not from forensic technology, not from a cold case review conducted in a conference room, but from a young woman who had grown up carrying the weight of a morning she had been 4 years old to witness. In the summer of 2018, the daughter of Robert and Christy Schellberg was 22 years old. She had graduated from high school. She had begun an adult life in the state where her father had relocated after leaving Trego. She had carried, for the entirety of her conscious memory, a formless and persistent knowledge that lived below the threshold of language, something that she knew the shape of without being able to name it, the way you know the shape of a room in the dark, by proximity, and by what you have always understood to be there. She went to speak with law enforcement in the summer of 2018. She did not go to the Lincoln County Sheriff's Office initially. She went to a law enforcement agency in the state where she and her father had been living. She asked them to help her reach the right people. She asked them what she should do with what she knew. What she told investigators, in a formal recorded statement taken over the course of multiple sessions that summer, was this. She had not been asleep on the morning of October 7th, 1999. She had been 4 years old and she had been awake, or she had woken, and she had seen and heard things that a 4-year-old child sees and hears, without context, without the language to give them meaning, but with the absolute and unedited clarity of perception that very young children possess before they learn to interpret or dismiss what they witness. She told investigators that she remembered her father being in the house that morning. She remembered sounds. She remembered her mother's voice and then the absence of her mother's voice. She remembered her father leaving and coming back. She remembered being told to stay in her room and staying there for a long time. She had not understood at 4 what she was remembering. She had not had the framework to understand it. But as she grew older, as the nightmares recurred, as she assembled the fragments of her early childhood memory against the fact of her mother's unexplained disappearance, The shape of what she knew became impossible to continue not knowing. She told investigators, "I didn't understand what I saw when I was little. I understand it now, and I couldn't keep it inside anymore. I couldn't keep carrying it." The Lincoln County Sheriff's Office was contacted by investigators from the state where the daughter had come forward. A formal interagency coordination process began in the late summer of 2018. The cold case file on Christy Schellberg was formally reopened by the Lincoln County Sheriff's Office on September 4, 2018, 19 years after Christy's disappearance. The investigation that followed was extensive, methodical, and conducted with the full suite of forensic and investigative tools that 2018 made available. Investigators re-examined physical evidence from the original case that had been stored in the evidence system. Items that had been collected in 1999 and processed with the technology of 1999 were subjected to modern forensic analysis. DNA testing was applied to biological material that had been collected from the Schellberg property in October 1999. A retired Lincoln County deputy who had worked the original investigation and who had never stopped thinking about the case in the years between, spoke to investigators reviewing the cold file. He had kept personal notes from his time working the case in 1999. In those notes, written in the close and careful handwriting of someone documenting things for a future reader who might need them, he had written about Robert Schellberg's behavior during the initial investigation. He had written, specifically, about the composure, about the hands folded on the table. He had written, "This man does not behave the way a husband behaves when his wife is lost in the mountains. He behaves the way a man behaves when he is waiting for a process to conclude." Those notes became part of the investigation record. Investigators also, in 2018 and 2019, conducted a renewed search of terrain in the area surrounding the Schellberg property, using ground-penetrating technology and aerial survey methods that had not been available in 1999. The landscape of northwestern Montana does not yield its secrets easily. The national forest is vast. The terrain is dense and deeply folded. But investigators, working from the daughter's account of what she remembered about that morning, fragments of direction, fragments of sound, the partial geography of a 4-year-old's perception, had a narrower area of focus than the broad grid searches of 1999. In the spring of 2019, nearly 20 years after Christy Schellberg walked out of her house and did not return, investigators found her. The details of the recovery location have been treated with appropriate restraint in public reporting, out of respect for the family. What is known publicly is that physical remains were located in a forested area within a distance from the property consistent with a single morning's movement, and that the forensic findings associated with those remains provided investigators with the evidentiary basis they needed to proceed. Robert Schellberg was arrested on June 14, 2019. He was living, at the time of his arrest, in a house in a small community in the state he had moved to after leaving Trego. It was early morning when investigators from the Lincoln County Sheriff's Office arrived, accompanied by law enforcement from the local jurisdiction. The arrest was conducted at 6:22 in the morning. Robert Schellberg came to the door when they knocked. He looked at the badges and the faces and the papers they held, and he said nothing for a long moment. A detective present at the arrest later described his expression. He didn't look surprised. He looked like a man who had been expecting a knock for 20 years and had finally stopped being surprised that it was taking so long. He was taken into custody without incident. He was transported back to Montana. The news of his arrest reached Trego and Lincoln County broadly, and then the regional press, and then the national outlets that cover cold cases with the appetite of an audience that has learned to need them, with the particular velocity that 2019's information environment provides. The story spread in hours. By the end of June 14th, it was on the wire services. By the end of June 15th, it had been picked up by outlets across the country. The community reaction in Trego and Lincoln County was complex in the way that reactions to long-awaited events always are. There were people who had believed for 20 years that Robert Schellberg had done something to Christy, and for whom the arrest felt like a vindication, so long anticipated that it arrived accompanied by grief rather than triumph. Because the confirmation of what you feared is never actually satisfying, even when you needed it to be true. There were people who had not known what to believe, who had held both possibilities for 2 decades, and for whom the arrest was a resolution of a kind, the uncertainty collapsing into a terrible clarity. There were people who had believed Robert, or at least had not allowed themselves to disbelieve him, who experienced the news with the disorientation that comes from discovering that the charitable interpretation you extended to someone was not warranted. There were people who had known Christy as a child and as a young woman, who had been to school with her, who had sat beside her at community events, who received the news of the arrest and felt, in a way that does not reduce to language, the specific weight of 20 years of her absence redistributed into something they could finally name. Christy's mother was alive to receive the news. She was 71 years old. She had kept the photograph on her kitchen table through 20 years of not knowing. When the call came, she said, according to those who were present with her, very little. She held the phone. She looked at the photograph. She said, in a voice that the person beside her described as quieter than any sound that room had ever held, "They found her." The case proceeded through the legal system over the following years with the deliberate pace that serious proceedings require. Robert Schellberg was charged in Lincoln County with deliberate homicide in the death of Christy Schellberg. He entered a plea of not guilty. His legal representation challenged aspects of the evidence, argued about the admissibility of certain forensic findings, and worked through the pre-trial process that all serious cases work through. There were those, in the period following the arrest, who maintained that the case against Robert Schellberg was circumstantial in key respects, that a daughter's recovered childhood memories were inherently complex evidence, that the forensic findings from remains 20 years old were necessarily limited in the specificity of what they could establish. These arguments are not inherently unreasonable as matters of legal and evidentiary theory. They were the arguments his defense mounted, and they were mounted seriously. There were those who looked at the totality of the evidence, the timeline that did not resolve, the coat on the hook, the composure at the table, the departure from the community, the narrative about Christy having simply walked away, the daughter's account, the forensic findings, and who felt that the totality told a story that assembled, had only one coherent reading. In the courtroom, the daughter took the stand. She was in her mid-20s by the time the case reached trial. She sat in a witness chair in a Lincoln County courtroom in a place she had not lived since she was 4 years old, and she described what she remembered from the morning of October 7, 1999. She had prepared for years to do this. She had worked with mental health professionals. She had done the difficult labor of organizing fragmentary early memory into testimony that could be offered and withstood cross-examination. She spoke clearly. She did not look away. She said, "I was 4 years old and I didn't know what was happening. I know now. And I came here to say it in front of everyone because she was my mother and she deserved someone to say it." The courtroom, witnesses reported, was very quiet when she said that. The jury deliberated. The weight of 20 years of absence, 20 years of questions, 20 years of a toy truck lying on its side, and a coat on a hook, and a half-finished cup of coffee. All of it had been placed before 12 people charged with deciding what could be established beyond reasonable doubt. Robert Schellberg was convicted of deliberate homicide in the death of Christy Schellberg. He was sentenced to a term of imprisonment appropriate to the gravity of the offense under Montana law. He was led out of the courtroom on the day of sentencing, with the same stillness that the detective's notes had described, the stillness of a man in whom the waiting was, at last, done. Music returns now, the same cello from the opening, the same low and sustained note, but something has shifted in its quality, something that could almost be described as resolved without quite being resolved, because some things do not resolve, they simply continue. A single bell tone, clear, deliberate. What the Christy Schellberg case asks of us, what it has always asked, since the morning of October 7, 1999, when a woman left her home in a small Montana town and did not come back, is not simply the question of how such a thing happens. That question, as terrible as it is, has answers. The more difficult question, the one that lingers long after the verdict has been read and the courtroom has emptied, is the question of what the people around such a situation know, and when they know it, and what they do with knowing. A neighbor heard a truck on the gravel road at 5:47 in the morning. She told the investigators in 1999. It was noted and held and carried through 20 years of a cold file in a cabinet in Lincoln County. A former deputy wrote careful notes because some part of him understood that a future reader would need them. A young woman grew up carrying the fragments of a morning she had been too small to understand, and when she was old enough to understand, she picked up a telephone and called the people who could help her do something with what she knew. The case of Christy Schellberg is not extraordinary in the landscape of American missing persons and cold cases because of what happened in it. It is extraordinary because of what held through 20 years of uncertainty. The community's memory of a woman who deserved better, the institutional persistence of investigators who kept the file open, the particular and devastating courage of a daughter who decided that carrying the truth privately was no longer something she was willing to do. Christy Schellberg was 31 years old. She had dark hair and a laugh that made rooms warmer. She left behind a daughter who grew up and did the bravest thing she could have done. She left behind a mother who kept a photograph on a kitchen table for 20 years and waited for the morning she could say, in a voice quieter than any sound the room had ever held, "They found her." Justice did not give Christy Schellberg her life back. It cannot do that. What it gave was the truth spoken aloud, in a room, in front of everyone who needed to hear it. Sometimes that is what justice looks like. Sometimes it is smaller than you imagined it would be, and more important than you can fully express, and entirely worth the 20 years it took to arrive. The swing hung still. The coat hung on the hook. And then, 20 years later, a young woman walked into a room and said her mother's name.